Serious? People who listen to emergency radio scanners, what is the creepiest pandemonious thing that you've heard over the airwaves? I was working in a police and ambulance dispatch center. A dispatcher was on the phone with a young child who was telling him that his mommy was really sick and wasn't moving. The dispatcher stayed on the line while an officer responded to the address. He asked the boy to let the officer in the house, and as they were walking towards the mom's bedroom, you can hear her asking why there was a cop in their house. Turns out she had a migraine and was taking a nap, and the boy called 911 to help her. Everything turned out fine, but for a couple minutes there I was pretty nervous. I was fascinated with scanners when I was in my early teens. One night, back when you could pick up any cell phone call within miles, as they were analog and unencrypted in the 900 MHz band, I was scanning through the 900 MHz band and my scanner stopped on an unused frequency. All I heard was, "And then I'll bring the Rottweiler in and let him frick you. How'd you like that?" It was kinda shocking to my 13-year-old self. I think I switched frequencies when I heard that. Now I wonder what else was said. When we had the Waldo Canyon fires here in Colorado, a buddy of mine sent me a link to a scanner broadcast keyed in on the firefighters. They entered a house that was about to go up in flames and found a woman dead in a bathtub, and then left because the house was about to go up. It was really straightforward, like, yep, lady's dead, let's go. What a hellish situation to be that calm in. If I remember correctly, I thought it was only one elderly couple who died in that fire as they didn't want to leave their house or something like that. I evacuated with my mom while the fire was rolling down the hill toward our apartment about 600 feet behind and could see the flames clear as day. Firefighter here was sitting in our pumper while doing some work in the cab when someone started reading numbers over the radio. His voice didn't sound like anyone we knew in dispatch and wasn't one of our other two stations either. Dispatch heard it as well, had no idea what it was, but we have the numbers written down just in case. It was creepy because he read them slowly and clearly. Who knows? Spies from the neighboring city's fire department. I worked at an for a while, so the scanner was always on. One night the ambulance was responding to a call about a young man that was unresponsive and the mom was doing CPR. A couple of minutes later it came in that it was attempted suicide, and then when they arrived they called for a coroner and could hear the family screaming and crying in the background. Right after that we get a call and it's our co-worker. Her son had hung himself with a belt in a closet and tried to resuscitate him and she was hysterical. Truly heartbreaking. Some years ago our fire chief was the first responder to a call that turned out to be his son having died choking himself for pleasure. I can't imagine you ever really recover from that. Heard a man saying, hey shush, quiet, you're not getting out, shush, you're not leaving, you're mine. I live in rural Pennsylvania by a large patch of woods. He was hunting in the woods and was talking to himself while aiming. Grew up in a remote area where police were hours away, so we all listened to scanners and would rush to help as a community until police got there. A neighbor called in a motorcycle accident up the street from our house at a bad curve where there had been lots of accidents over the years. My dad would often take us along to help. We rushed out knowing an ambulance is usually at least 45 minutes away. We pulled up to the motorcycle and a guy laying in the ditch. I knew something was different because dad told me to stay in the car. It was his best friend. He was dead. It was one of the few times in my life I saw dad cry. I am a radio officer in the Coast Guard. Kind of half 911 operator, half air traffic controller. I've heard lots of chilling calls. People drop dead on deck and try to get resuscitated. People whose vessels are going down and they know they won't be around long and give you messages to families, etc. One of the worst, a fella was on a fishing boat with his pal. It was really early in the morning, and he was cruising along. Well, the guy must have been turned to the back of the boat while his buddy was in the back messing around with some gear. He didn't notice a sandbar, and hit it hard. His friend was thrown from the back into the wheelhouse and bashed his head. The guy called in while doing CPR, and his friend was clearly dead from the description, but he just kept going. Crap like that can keep you up at night. I'm a cop, so listening to a police radio is something I obviously do all day, every day. Car crashes, house break-ins, assaults, those are all routine. The calls that send chills up my spine are actually the silent ones. When you hear a radio squelch, and maybe one or two words from another officer, fight or gun, and then silence. Then there's just dead air, and everyone stops what they're doing while dispatch tries to figure out who it was and where they are. As a dispatcher and Leo's spouse, those silent calls are the absolute worst. Our officer assist tones are haunting. My dad was a volunteer firefighter, so we always had the scanner on. One night when I was about 10, the tornado sirens went off. We ran to the basement, and once we were settled we turned on the scanner. That night I listened to police and firefighters, many of whom's voice I recognized, give a play-by-play of our town getting destroyed as if it was a goddamn football game. I listened to business names and street names trying to remember where my friends lived. My dad left to help. Then we heard my street. The next morning the house 2 doors down was gone. I didn't sleep well for a long time after that. Sometimes ignorance really is bliss. When I was working for a federal government land management agency in Montana a few years back, something really creepy came over the repeater network. While we were working in a canyon that had very poor radio reception, we heard a very long, creepy, and drawn out moan come over the air. This was followed by a very weak, in both reception and tone, "Help me," in a woman's voice. All of us freaked the frick out. These weak cries for help kept repeating low guttural, "Help me," on until dispatch finally stepped in and said, "This is a federal emergency network. Unless you have an emergency, get off this channel." This was followed by another plea for help, then a gunshot and screaming. It turns out 2 local crazies were out four-wheeling, going straight up steep embankments, when the ATV flipped backwards, pinning the man under the ATV. Both of them being high on some substance, they started freaking out. The man, being perfectly fine, except for being pinned by the leg and high, started to hallucinate that he was bleeding out, pulled out his handgun and shot himself to make it quicker. Because they were four-wheeling so far back in the sticks, a helicopter was needed to retrieve the body. Must have been on some heavy crap to even contemplate shooting himself. God dang. I work for a newspaper, and we have a scanner in the newsroom. I used to work the overnight shift, alone, so I was responsible for keeping an ear out for stuff going on. Luckily, it's a pretty small town, so it's pretty quiet at night. One night, I heard a cop responding to a suspicious group of people in a park. Then, dead air, which wasn't entirely unusual. I heard the call in, moments later, from the officer coming in to back him up when she found him shot in the head, near death. I listened as the other officers searched desperately for the man who shot him. It was so scary hearing how desperate, helpless, and furious those officers sounded. That was several years ago now, and I will never forget it. I always wanted to go into law enforcement as my grandfather was a chief of police, so I had a pro model scanner that I listened to as often as most listen to their favorite FM radio station. When I was 18, I worked the graveyard shift. Well, after I was done with work, I came home, turned on my scanner and went to sleep as I usually did. I woke around 11 AM and was listening to the dispatchers. All of a sudden they mentioned my home address. I was shocked and got out of bed excitedly to go tell everyone in my family that I just heard our address on the scanner. When I turned the corner in the hallway to go into the family room, the people from our fire department were coming in the door and my dad laying on the sofa in full cardiac arrest. I will never forget that moment as long as I live. For your information, my dad did survive but was never the same. He had 7 full arrests that day and was in a coma for a month. He was 48 and died at 57. He was taking an average of 160 pills, yes 160 pills, per day to survive. I think he just got tired of taking all of the medication. My dad stopped taking his pills as well. It was hard to let him go, but we had no right to keep him. He did what was right for him. I hope you have come to terms with it. Easy. There was a huge thunderstorm. Police mentioned a young black male brandishing a gun, dressed in nothing but a towel. HQ said something like, to confirm, armed young black male dressed in only a towel around his waist. Officer, ma'am, I didn't say anything about it being on his waist. I'm a Leo in a rural area, so we get odd calls pretty often from elderly people that are starting to lose their grip on reality. One time around midnight I got dispatched to a call where an elderly woman saw children in her yard. She was worried about them and wanted them sent home. On the way there she's still on the phone with dispatch describing them and where they are in her yard. I get to her house, A lightly wooded area on a rural road about 100 yards off the road. No yard lights or anything. There aren't any children in the yard, so I knock on her door. She invites me in and starts telling me about the kids. She points to a window that peers out into the darkness and says there was a little girl standing there staring at her. The little girl smiled, gave a wave and walked away from the window. The woman knew she was still there because she could still hear the little girl giggling. I went back to my car and left. We get calls like this all the time that the person is going crazy. Mental illness, old age, drugs, etc. But they are so serious it almost makes you believe. My time to shine. My then girlfriend, now wife, worked the same city 911 system as paramedic. She worked days, I worked nights. She had finished her shift and went home. We lived together. I was working overnight. Around 3 in the morning, I heard dispatch send a unit to our address for a shooting. A lot of times these are unfounded, but I was still freaking out. The unit was operating on a different band, different radio bands for different parts of the city, so my partner and I switched to that band to listen. We heard it was a confirmed death from a gunshot wound. I was crying and driving up to my house, 20 minutes away, but then heard the report. 30-year-old male, gunshot wound to the chest, coroner request. I page someone who tells me again that it is a male, not female, that is dead, in my house. I call my girlfriend. She doesn't pick up. For some reason I log on to Facebook and see a picture she uploaded of her and her niece at her brother's house. I totally forgot she was babysitting that night. Still didn't answer who the heck was in our house. Turns out 2 men broke into our house and one shot the other. I was scared, thinking what if my girlfriend had been home. But the neighbor saw the 2 men sitting in a car across the street for a few hours, most likely waiting until she left. This was the worst thing to hear over the radio, and such a relief in the end. Turns out 2 men broke into our house and one shot the other. Alright Jimmy, you go upstairs, I'll go downstairs. Forget your partner is upstairs. Get spooked and shoot him. I've always wondered if this happens. The most heart-wrenching thing for me is final turnouts. When I was with fire rescue, one of our firefighters from our station was killed. At the service, we had our radio, and they do a final turnout for your station along with his badge number. 14 years later and I still tear up thinking about it. I wouldn't say creepy, as much as funny, and yes, it did cause a bit of pandemonium. I've stated in another Ask Reddit that I'm a model railroader. Well, I'm also a railfan, so it's not uncommon for me to be out with a camera and a scanner listening to the train dispatch radio calls, mostly to get an idea of when a train is coming so I can photograph it. Couple years back, I was out one night when I happened to hear a rather amusing call between a dispatcher and the local fire department's radio dispatch. I'll try to recreate it best I can, but as with everything, it's one of those you had to have been there stories. CSX dispatch. City FD, this is dispatch for CSX. Could you roll a truck or 2 down our way? FD, what's the matter? CSX dispatch, we have a fire. FD, nature of the fire. CSX dispatch, diesel fuel fire. FD, locomotive spill. CSX, locomotive. FD, okay, we'll roll 2 trucks. Just head down to the yard there. CSX, oh no, hang on, a few minutes pass. CSX, okay, it'll be at the 3rd Street crossing in about 4 minutes. You can meet it there. What happened was the second locomotive back on a train blew its engine and threw a rod through the crankcase. The heat caused the fuel to catch fire, and it torched the engine while it was still moving. Most unique and interesting thing here so far. It's quite a long time since you've been able to monitor police radio in NZ, so this was quite a while ago, probably 2001 or so. The dispatcher called a 10-1, attention all units, for any unit that could respond urgently to a 1F, assist fire ambulance, to provide urgent assistance for a panicking caller whose infant was choking. Ambulance were more than 10 minutes away. A unit, area sergeant from memory, was only a minute or 2 away and responded immediately. There were then a series of radio transmission from the officer on scene update dispatch as he performed CPR on the, by then, unconscious infant. Each transmission was accompanied by the sound of his hysterical screaming, a crying mother in the background. After about 2-3 minutes and 4 or 5 transmissions, the next one had the sound of a crying infant, and the officer reported that the child had started breathing and was responsive. Ambulance arrived a few minutes later and the child was transported to hospital as status 3, which means moderate condition but not likely any threat to life. Was a pretty intense thing to hear. Conversely, the most amusing I recall was after a while where a number of officers had been doing area patrols around the area in search of someone reported to have been exposing themselves to vehicles. One of the units on site radioed the Delta Dog unit to see if he was at the scene yet. His reply, almost immediately, was "Yeah, I'm just putting my raincoat away." The description of the suspect, transmitted only a minute or so earlier, was a middle-aged man wearing a long raincoat. Mid-90s, San Fernando Valley, CA. Listening to a cheap Radio Shack scanner late one night when I hear this exchange between an LAPD unit and dispatch. "Officer, just observed a motorcycle traveling eastbound on Devonshire passing Tampa at a very high rate of speed." Dispatch, "Do you have a vehicle description?" Pause. "Officer, it had a red light on the back of it." That was the end of it. We have a man who assaulted his neighbor here because his TV was on and it's Earth Day. Burst out laughing. "This pirate hamster is here to steal all of your she's." Subscribe in 2.15 seconds or he'll do it. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check out another video. Or don't. Either way, have a great day, you magnificent people.